My name is Aaliyah, and I am 29 years old. I work as a corporate forensic accountant, a job that requires me to look beneath the surface and find the truth hidden in the numbers. My family recently disowned me for adopting a 5-year-old girl named Chloe, who was born deaf and mute. "You are insane, and you cannot even take care of yourself," my father shouted in front of our entire family. I took the little girl's hand and walked away anyway. The very next day, a well-dressed man arrived with bodyguards. "Are you the woman who helped my daughter?" he asked. I nodded. Then my father's phone calls started coming in non-stop. I just watched the phone ring and ignored every single call. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. You will want to hear how they paid a terrible price for their cruelty. Growing up in Atlanta meant privilege and high expectations for my family. My parents, Richard and Vivian, were obsessed with image, social standing, and projecting absolute perfection. They had built their wealth in real estate and expected their daughters to marry into equal or greater power. My older sister, Kendra, played the game perfectly. She was the golden child, a socialite who married Terrence, a flashy hedge fund manager. Together, they were the poster couple for Atlanta elite. I chose a very different path. I loved logic, uncovering the truth, and finding justice, which led me to forensic accounting. My modest corporate salary and quiet lifestyle were a constant source of embarrassment for my parents. Tonight was Kendra and Terrence's extravagant 10th wedding anniversary party. The family mansion in Buckhead had been completely transformed for the occasion. Valets parked luxury cars along the sweeping driveway. A string quartet played softly in the grand foyer. Waiters carrying trays of champagne and expensive caviar navigated through a sea of politicians, business moguls, and local celebrities. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over women in designer gowns and men in tailored tuxedos. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. Instead, it became the night my family showed their true, ugly colors. I arrived a little late, holding tightly to Chloe's small hand. I had finalized her adoption just 2 days prior after fostering her for several months. Chloe wore a simple but beautiful floral dress I had bought her for the occasion. She looked up at the massive crystal chandelier with wide eyes, her small fingers signing the word for light. I smiled and signed back, telling her she looked beautiful. I was nervous but genuinely hopeful. I thought that despite our differences, my family would see this innocent child and welcome her with open arms. I could not have been more wrong. We had barely stepped past the grand staircase when my mother spotted us. Vivian was wearing a custom emerald silk gown, holding a glass of champagne, and laughing with this editor of a prominent lifestyle magazine. The moment her eyes landed on Chloe, her practiced smile vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute horror and disgust. She quickly excused herself from the editor and marched toward us. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor. Before I could even say hello, she grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip and dragged me into the adjacent study, pulling Chloe along with us. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, cutting off the sounds of the string quartet and the laughing guests. "What on earth are you doing?" Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "Who is this child and why is she here?" I stood my ground, keeping Chloe safely behind me. "This is Chloe, Mom. I adopted her. The paperwork went through on Friday. She is your granddaughter." My mother stared at me as if I had just confessed to a terrible crime. "Are you out of your mind?" she demanded, pacing the floor of the study. "We have a photographer from a major magazine out there right now. They are here to take pictures of our family for a feature on Black excellence. We are projecting success, wealth, and flawless genetics, and you bring a defective stray into my house." The words hit me like a physical blow. Defective stray. I looked down at Chloe, praying she could not read the hatred on my mother's face. "Chloe is not defective," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "She is deaf and mute, and she is a beautiful, intelligent little girl. She is my daughter." Vivian let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your daughter." You are a single accountant making a mediocre salary. You cannot afford the lifestyle this family represents, let alone the medical bills for a handicapped child. You are going to ruin the family portrait. I expressly told the photographer we needed a perfect generational shot. Kendra and Terrence's children are wearing custom couture, and you bring this child wearing a department store dress, communicating with hand gestures. You are a complete embarrassment to everything your father and I have built. I felt sick to my stomach. I had spent my entire life trying to be seen by them, trying to earn their respect through my hard work and integrity. But in that moment, looking at my mother's furious, hateful expression, I realized that my character meant absolutely nothing to her. The only thing that mattered was how things looked to the outside world, to her wealthy friends and the magazine readers. The study door swung open again. Terrence stepped into the room looking sharp in a velvet tuxedo jacket. He closed the door behind him and let out a long, theatrical sigh, shaking his head as he looked at me and Chloe. Vivian immediately turned to him. "Terrence, thank goodness. Please talk some sense into your sister-in-law. She claims she adopted this disabled child and brought her here to ruin your anniversary party." Terrence smirked a cruel, arrogant expression that I had always despised. He walked over to my father's heavy mahogany desk, pulled a silver pen from his pocket, and opened his checkbook. He scribbled a number, ripped the check from the book, and walked over to me. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he let it flutter to the floor right at my feet. $10,000, Terrence said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Consider it an early Christmas present, Aaliyah, or a reality check. Take that money, put this kid back in whatever group home or orphanage you found her in, and go buy yourself a dress that actually fits in at this party." I stared at the check on the rug, then up at my brother-in-law. "You think you can buy my daughter and throw her away like garbage?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Terrence scoffed, taking a sip from his bourbon glass. "Daughter? Let us be realistic here. Your little forensic accounting salary barely covers your rent in that mediocre neighborhood. You do not have the resources to raise a child with special needs. You are trying to play savior, but you are just making yourself look pathetic. Kendra and I are building an empire. Your parents are cementing a legacy. You dragging a mute kid into our high society circle is bad for business. It makes us look like a charity case." He leaned in closer, his cologne overpowering. "Take the money, Aaliyah. Fix this mistake before you humiliate us any further. If you walk out there with that kid, people will talk. They will wonder why the successful Davenport and Adams families have a struggling single mother adopting disabled kids. It ruins the brand. Kendra is out there entertaining the mayor and 2 state senators right now." Terrence added, his voice rising in irritation. "We are trying to secure investors for my new hedge fund expansion. Image is everything in this city, Aaliyah. People want to invest with winners. They want to associate with perfection. When they look at us, they need to see invincibility. When they look at you and this child, they see weakness. They see a burden. We cannot afford to carry your burdens tonight." I looked at Vivian, waiting for her to reprimand Terrence for his sheer cruelty. Instead, my mother nodded in agreement. "Terrence is right," she said coldly. "We cannot have you jeopardizing our social standing. You have always been the difficult child, Aaliyah, always choosing the hard, unglamorous path. But this is the final straw. You are bringing shame to the family name." I knelt down and picked up the check from the floor. Chloe squeezed my hand, her small face filled with confusion and worry. I signed to her that everything was okay, that she was safe. Then I stood back up and looked my mother and my brother-in-law straight in the eyes. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, a mixture of profound sadness and rising fury. I looked at the check in my hand. $10,000. To them, it was pocket change. To them, human lives and familial bonds were simply transactions, liabilities to be managed, or assets to be leveraged. They truly believed that their money gave them the right to dictate who deserved love and who deserved to be thrown away. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. The anxiety about fitting in, the lifelong desperation for their approval, it all evaporated in that stuffy mahogany study. The disgust I felt for them was absolute. They had all the money in the world, but they were the poorest, most miserable people I had ever known. The heavy mahogany door clicked open once more, and the suffocating tension in the room thickened into absolute dread. My father Richard stood in the doorway. He was an imposing figure, a man who had built a real estate empire through ruthless calculations and cold eliminations. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo, his sharp eyes darting from my mother's furious face to Terrence's arrogant smirk, and finally landing on me and Chloe. He did not look at the little girl with the eyes of a caring grandfather. He looked at her like a bad, entirely worthless investment. He closed the door behind him with a soft, final thud that seemed to echo loudly in the cavernous study. My father never raised his voice, ever. He simply did not need to. His quiet authority was always far more terrifying than my mother's endless screaming. He walked slowly behind his massive desk, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, taking his sweet time to let the silence stretch and break my nerves. But I was not the terrified teenager I used to be. I held Chloe's hand tighter, feeling her small, steady pulse against my own cold, sweating palm. "What is this ridiculous disruption, Aaliyah?" Richard asked, his tone deceptively mild and smooth. "Your mother and brother-in-law have a room full of highly influential guests waiting for them right outside this door. We are hosting state senators, corporate judges, and wealthy venture capitalists tonight. We are projecting a flawless image of unassailable Black excellence. Yet I walk in here to find you holding a strange child who clearly does not belong in this elevated environment." "I adopted her dad," I said, keeping my posture completely rigid and my racing voice as steady as I could manage. "Her true name is Chloe. She is exactly 5 years old. She is deaf, and she is my wonderful daughter. I brought her here tonight because I foolishly thought my own family would genuinely want to meet her." Richard took a slow sip of his scotch, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. He set the heavy crystal glass down with a very sharp clink. "You have always possessed a fatal, tragic flaw, Aaliyah. You constantly let raw emotion cloud your better judgment. You let weak sentimentality completely ruin your otherwise sharp logic. This family did not achieve its current social standing by playing a charity ward. We built this massive empire by making highly strategic alliances, by associating with obvious winners, and by brutally cutting out any dead weight. That random child is nothing but dead weight." I felt the crisp air violently leave my burning lungs, but I forced myself to deeply breathe. "She is a real human being, Dad. She is a sweet little girl who desperately needs a loving family." "She needs a highly specialized facility," Richard corrected coldly. "Not a struggling forensic accountant living in a very mediocre, cramped apartment. You are completely delusional if you think you can properly manage this. But more importantly, you are entirely delusional if you think I will ever allow you to attach this family's prestigious name to your pathetic, embarrassing savior complex. Terrence's hedge fund is launching its absolute biggest round of corporate funding tonight. Your sister Kendra is securing a prominent position on the local hospital board. We do not have any room for a handicapped dependent dragging down our flawless public narrative." He leaned forward slowly, placing both large hands flat on his polished desk. The brutal ultimatum hung heavily in the stale air before he even spoke it, heavy, dark, and utterly inevitable. "I am going to make this very simple for you right now," Aaliyah, Richard said. "You have exactly one clear choice tonight. You will take Terrence's generous check right this second. You will walk straight out the back door so no important person sees you. You will quietly return that strange child to whatever state-run facility you foolishly found her in by early tomorrow morning. You will walk away from this absurd, embarrassing adoption, and you will never mention it again to anyone. Do that simple thing, and you keep your rightful position in this proud family. You keep your generous quarterly trust fund distributions. You keep your massive future inheritance. You forever remain a true Davenport." He paused deliberately, letting the immense weight of the money settle over the quiet room. Or he continued smoothly, his dark voice dropping a full octave. "You walk out of here with that broken girl. If you wrongly choose that child over this powerful family, you are no longer a Davenport. I will immediately cut you off completely. I will permanently sever your access to the entire family trust. I will completely write you out of the final will. You will receive absolutely nothing. No vital financial backing, no professional networking favors, no reliable safety net. You will be entirely on your own forever. Choose right now. The suffocating silence in the room was absolute. Vivian stood proudly with her thin arms crossed, a deeply smug expression of ultimate victory radiating on her face. She perfectly knew how much I truly relied on that generous trust fund to adequately supplement my modest accountant's salary. Terence was grinning widely, happily swirling the cold ice in his bourbon glass, fully expecting me to quickly break. They all expected me to loudly cry, to desperately beg, to pitifully negotiate. They expected me to fall directly to my shaking knees and desperately apologize for inconveniencing their perfect, glittering evening. They genuinely thought their vast money completely owned my entire soul. I looked down at little Chloe. She was watching my face intently, clearly sensing the raw hostility in the room, even if she could not hear the vicious words being spoken. I knelt down to her eye level. I smiled gently, carefully, making sure my facial expression was full of deep warmth and absolute unwavering certainty. I raised my trembling hands and signed to her, "You are my whole heart. We are going home right now." Chloe smiled a brilliant, truly beautiful smile that instantly illuminated the dark, highly toxic energy of that cold study. She happily signed back, "I love you, Mom." I stood up tall. I did not shed a single weak tear. I did not offer a single desperate plea. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me just moments before completely vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, very sharp clarity. I looked at the $10,000 check I was tightly holding in my left hand. I held it up high so Terence, Vivian, and Richard could all see it perfectly clearly. Slowly, very deliberately, I ripped the offensive check straight down the middle. Terence's extremely smug smile faltered instantly. I put the torn pieces back together and ripped them again violently, tearing the thick paper into tiny, completely meaningless shreds. I walked right up to Terence, looking him dead in the eye, and opened my right hand, letting the shredded pieces of his pathetic bribe flutter down onto his expensive, shiny Italian leather shoes. "You can happily keep your dirty money," I said, my voice echoing with a quiet, truly lethal calm. "You can keep your precious trust fund, your vast inheritance, and your fake, deeply miserable legacy. You are all completely bankrupt in every single way that actually matters. I would much rather live out on the cold streets with my sweet daughter than spend another brief second pretending to be part of this highly toxic, utterly soulless family." I turned my straight back on them forever. I did not wait for Richard to furiously shout or for Vivian to loudly gasp. I simply took Chloe's small hand, turned the cold brass knob, and walked right out of the dark study. Stepping back into the bright foyer, I completely ignored the lively string quartet and the wealthy, laughing guests. I kept my head held high, shielded Chloe from their deeply judgmental stares, and walked straight through the massive crowd. The valet opened the front doors, and a sudden gust of freezing night air violently hit my face. I stepped out onto the sweeping portico, the heavy doors closing behind me. I had walked away. I took off my tailored jacket and wrapped it tightly around Chloe's shivering shoulders. I quickly pulled out my phone to order an Uber home. I tapped request, but a red notification instantly popped up. Payment declined. Frowning, I opened my personal banking app. My checking account balance shockingly read $0. Panic rising, I urgently tried to access the family trust portal. Access denied. User privileges permanently revoked by primary trustee. Richard had not waited a single minute. He had instantly frozen all my accounts. I checked my small purse. I was left with absolutely nothing but $40 in cold, hard cash. I was stranded in the freezing night. My phone screen then flashed a new incoming phone call. I answered the call with a shaking hand. It was the driver I had attempted to book just seconds before my accounts were completely frozen. He was waiting at the bottom of the grand driveway. I told him I only had $40 in cash and asked if that would be enough to get my daughter and me back to our apartment. He kindly agreed. I wrapped my coat tighter around Chloe, lifted her into my tired arms, and walked down the long, sweeping driveway, leaving the glittering mansion behind us, forever. The ride home was completely silent and dark. The high-end, cinematic quality of my former life had instantly dissolved into a harsh, gritty reality. We arrived at my modest apartment, and I carried a sleeping Chloe inside, tucking her safely into her small bed. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, mentally preparing for the brutal war I knew was coming. My father was not a man who made empty threats. He was a highly ruthless tactician. I perfectly knew the immediate financial severance was only the very first strike. The real calculated attack would inevitably happen at dawn. The next morning, I arrived at my corporate accounting firm exactly at 8. The sleek glass doors and polished steel corridors felt unusually cold. As a senior corporate forensic accountant, I was highly accustomed to walking into high-stakes meetings analyzing incredibly complex variables and dismantling financial fraud. Today, however, the fraud was waiting specifically for me. Before I could even reach my quiet cubicle, 2 large security guards stepped directly into my path. They silently escorted me straight to the Human Resources Department. My boss, a man who had highly praised my meticulous audits just yesterday, sat behind a large desk looking incredibly nervous. Next to him sat the stern head of Human Resources. They did not even offer me a seat. "We are terminating your employment effective immediately," my boss said, completely refusing to meet my eyes. He quickly slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth desk. "Your access to the building and all corporate networks is currently being completely revoked." I stood completely still. On what grounds, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My performance reviews have always been absolutely flawless. I just saved this entire firm $2 million on the Heavy Harrison audit last week." My boss swallowed hard, looking physically ill. "We do not need to provide any grounds. Your position is at will. However, circumstances have radically changed. Our absolute largest institutional investor directly threatened to pull their entire portfolio this morning unless we completely severed ties with you." I knew exactly who that investor was. Terrence. He directly managed the massive hedge fund that kept my entire firm afloat. He had aggressively used his vast financial leverage to execute a swift corporate hit. He was intentionally ensuring I had absolutely no income, no reliable safety net, and no possible way to adequately provide for Chloe. "You are firing me because my arrogant brother-in-law threw a massive tantrum," I stated clearly. My boss looked down at his shaking hands. "We simply cannot afford to lose his enormous fund, Aaliyah. I am truly sorry. You will not receive any severance package. Security will closely watch you pack your personal items. You have exactly 10 minutes. I walked back to my desk with the 2 heavy security guards flanking me like wardens. I grabbed a small cardboard box and began tossing in my framed photos, my favorite pens, and my coffee mug. The utter humiliation was intentionally designed to rapidly break my spirit. My father and Terrence desperately wanted me to panic, to deeply feel the crushing weight of absolute poverty, and to immediately surrender. My phone buzzed loudly in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from my older sister, Kendra. The golden child was happily gloating. The message read exactly this: "Come crawl back and apologize to Mom and Dad right now, and I will ask Terrence to generously hire you as his janitor. Trash permanently belongs at the very bottom." I stared directly at the bright screen. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of despair. Instead, a cold, highly calculated survival mode instantly activated deep inside my brain. They wrongfully thought they had completely cornered me. They wrongfully thought I was just a helpless, desperate woman. They tragically forgot exactly what I effectively did for a living. I was a highly trained forensic accountant. I ruthlessly hunted down deeply hidden money. I systematically dismantled heavily encrypted financial webs. I completely ruined highly corrupt men for a living. And Terrence was undeniably the most corrupt man I knew. I quickly checked the current time on my computer monitor. My login session was remarkably still active. The corporate technology department was notoriously slow at this particular firm, usually taking at least 20 minutes to fully lock down an employee terminal. I had exactly 4 minutes left. I dropped my phone into the cardboard box and immediately sat down at my keyboard. The two security guards shifted uncomfortably behind me. "Are you packing?" one of them asked gruffly. "I am just logging out of my personal email," I lied smoothly, my fingers already flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. I did not go to my email. I completely bypassed the standard corporate firewall using a secret backdoor protocol I had cleverly discovered months ago during a routine security audit. I dove straight into the firm's highly secure, deeply hidden server architecture. Terrence's massive hedge fund continuously routed their quarterly compliance data through this specific private server. Because I had previously audited his complex accounts, I still had the heavily encrypted directory paths perfectly memorized. My focused eyes rapidly scanned the flowing lines of code like a cinematic sequence. I successfully isolated his master ledger. The file was absolutely massive, firmly locked behind triple-layer encryption. Terrence wrongfully thought he was a financial genius, but he was incredibly sloppy. He lazily reused the exact same structural algorithms for his dark shadow accounts that he confidently used for his public-facing portfolios. I swiftly ran a powerful decryption script I had personally coded last year, intensely watching the loading progress bar slowly inch forward. "Come on," I whispered quietly under my breath. The security guard stepped much closer. "You need to leave the building right now, miss." 30 seconds, I firmly said, absolutely not taking my focused eyes off the glowing screen. The progress bar finally hit 100%. The encrypted vault cracked wide open. Gigabytes of heavily guarded financial data flooded my secure temporary drive. I was intensely looking at Terrence's entire digital life. I clearly saw the shady offshore shell companies. I clearly saw the massive, completely undocumented wire transfers. I clearly saw the highly illegal real estate acquisitions completely hidden from the Internal Revenue Service. Terrence was not just quietly managing a wealthy hedge fund. He was aggressively laundering highly illicit money. I quickly grabbed a high-capacity thumb drive from my top desk drawer and violently jammed it into the hidden port beneath my desk. I instantly initiated the rapid download protocol. The massive files began transferring at a lightning speed. 20%, 40%, 60%. The guard grabbed my left shoulder forcefully. I said, "Your time is completely up. Completely. Step away from the computer immediately. I just need to clear my private browser history." I insisted, deliberately keeping my body angled to completely block his view of the rapidly flashing drive. 80%, 90%. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I perfectly knew if they caught me secretly downloading highly restricted client files, I would quickly face severe federal charges. I was intentionally risking absolutely everything, but I truly had absolutely nothing left to lose. 99%, 100%, transfer complete. I smoothly ejected the small drive, carefully palmed it silently in my left hand, and quickly hit the main kill switch on my terminal. The screen instantly went completely black. I stood up, casually, slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, and dropped the drive safely inside. I picked up my pathetic cardboard box with both hands. "I am finished," I said calmly. I walked out of the heavy glass doors, stepping onto the busy city sidewalk. The cold wind whipped against my face, but I barely felt it. My family had stripped away my high salary, my prestigious title, and my financial security. They deeply wanted me to return to them utterly broken and defeated. But they carelessly left me with the ultimate weapon. I tightly gripped the small digital drive inside my pocket. I held the undeniable power to permanently destroy Terrence's entire corrupt empire. I was not a victim. I was the architect of their ruin. 3 days later, the high-stakes corporate warfare of my past life felt like an entirely different universe. My stark reality had rapidly, violently shrunk down to the 4 damp walls of a rundown motel on the desolate outskirts of Atlanta. The wallpaper was peeling in sad yellow strips, and the broken air conditioning unit rattled loudly against the single dirty window. I had precisely $40 left to my name. My credit cards remained completely frozen by my father's ruthless decree. My professional reputation was entirely destroyed by Terrence's calculated corporate sabotage. Every single contact I reached out to had mysteriously stopped answering my urgent phone calls, clearly warned off by my highly influential family. I was entirely isolated, cut off from every single resource I had ever known. But the crushing poverty was not the worst part of this nightmare. The absolute worst part was the sudden terrifying heat radiating from Chloe's small body. She had woken up shivering violently, despite the thick, scratchy motel blankets I piled on top of her. Her breathing was shallow and dangerously rapid. When I pressed my hand against her forehead, her skin was practically burning. She had a severe, dangerously high fever. She looked up at me with glassy, unfocused eyes, her tiny hands weakly signing the word for hurt over her chest. Panic, cold and sharp, instantly gripped my entire chest. I could not take her to a high-end pediatric clinic. I had absolutely no health insurance and completely zero access to my previously robust emergency funds. I had to physically carry her out into the harsh elements. A heavy, relentless rainstorm was violently pounding against the motel roof, flooding the cracked asphalt parking lot outside. I quickly wrapped Chloe in my heavy winter coat, shielding her fragile body as best as I could, and firmly grasped my last few crumpled dollar bills. We stepped out into the freezing torrential downpour. The icy rain immediately soaked through my thin blouse, chilling me straight to the bone. I held Chloe tightly against my chest, feeling her unnatural, terrifying heat seeping through the thick fabric of my coat. We rapidly walked 3 treacherous blocks down a poorly lit, deeply broken sidewalk. The passing cars violently splashed dirty gray puddle water against my bare legs, but I did not stop moving. My singular focus was the flickering, broken neon sign of an old, run-down pharmacy at the desolate corner of the street. It was a gritty, highly dangerous neighborhood, the exact kind of place my wealthy parents would completely refuse to even drive through, let alone walk in this pouring rain. But desperate survival completely rewrote all the rules of my existence. I forcefully pushed open the heavy glass door of the pharmacy. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered unsteadily overhead, buzzing with a loud, highly irritating electrical hum. The store smelled strongly of harsh antiseptic and old dust. I practically ran down the narrow, poorly stocked aisles, frantically searching for children's fever-reducing medication. I found a small, dusty bottle of generic liquid ibuprofen on the very bottom shelf. I anxiously checked the price tag. $7.99. I breathed a heavy, shuddering sigh of absolute relief. I carried the small bottle and a cheap plastic bottle of purified water to the front register. The tired, bored cashier slowly scanned the items, completely ignoring my dripping wet hair and Chloe's visible distress. I handed over a damp $10 bill, quickly pocketed my meager change, and immediately ripped open the cardboard packaging. Right there in the dingy store aisle, I carefully administered the precise dosage to my sick daughter, gently coaxing her to swallow the cherry-flavored liquid. I held her close, softly rocking her back and forth, praying to whatever higher power was listening that her dangerous temperature would soon break. We stayed inside the pharmacy for exactly 20 minutes, just letting the heavy rain outside slightly subside. When Chloe finally stopped violently shivering, her breathing growing slightly more regular, I knew we had to quickly return to the damp motel room. I wrapped my heavy coat firmly around her again, took a very deep breath, and pushed back out into the freezing, unforgiving storm. The heavy rain had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle. The streetlights flickered poorly, casting long, deeply unsettling shadows across the wet pavement. I kept my head down, moving as rapidly as I safely could while carrying 50 pounds of dead weight. We had barely taken 10 frantic steps away from the pharmacy entrance when the deafening roar of highly tuned engines suddenly shattered the quiet street. 3 massive, completely black, heavily armored SUVs violently screeched around the street corner. Their blinding white headlights cut through the dark rain like massive spotlights. They moved with terrifying, highly coordinated military precision. The lead vehicle aggressively swerved violently, jumping the curb and completely blocking the broken sidewalk directly in front of me. The second heavy SUV forcefully slammed its brakes right behind me, entirely cutting off any possible retreat. The third massive vehicle angled sharply into the flooded street, aggressively boxing us in against the solid brick wall of the old pharmacy. We were completely trapped in a cage of solid black steel. My heart instantly hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I tightly clutched Chloe against my chest, instinctively stepping backward until my spine forcefully hit the cold, wet brick wall. The heavy tinted doors of the three vehicles simultaneously burst open. 6 massive, heavily armed men, in sharp black tactical suits, aggressively poured out into the freezing rain. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency, completely surrounding us in a tight, highly restrictive semicircle. I saw the distinct, terrifying bulges of holstered weapons under their dark jackets. My mind raced with absolute panic. Had my ruthless father actually sent armed mercenaries to violently rip my daughter from my arms? Had Terrence hired violent thugs to forcefully silence me because of the highly incriminating financial data I had successfully stolen? The rear door of the lead armored vehicle slowly opened. The heavy rain continued to fall, completely soaking my clothes and blurring my vision, but I could clearly see the tall, incredibly imposing figure stepping out into the harsh headlights. He was dressed in a dark, flawlessly tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my entire previous yearly salary. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying confidence of a man who absolutely owned everything he surveyed. It was Julian Davenport. I instantly recognized his sharp, aristocratic features from dozens of high-profile business magazines and prestigious charity gala photographs. He was the young, incredibly ruthless billionaire magnate who completely controlled the global tech and logistics sectors. He was the unseen, immensely powerful kingmaker of Atlanta's highest elite, a man whose mere whisper could instantly destroy massive corporate empires. Why was a global billionaire standing in the freezing rain in the worst part of town? Julian slowly walked toward the tight circle of armed guards. His dark eyes were completely fixed, unblinking, and filled with an intensity that terrified me. But he was not looking at me. His intense, piercing gaze was locked entirely on the small girl shivering against my chest. He stopped exactly 10 feet away. The heavy rain soaked his dark hair, but he completely ignored the freezing weather. His face, usually described by the media as an emotionless mask of cold stone, suddenly contorted. I saw his strong jaw clench violently. I saw his dark eyes widen with what looked like profound, absolute shock. "Get away from us!" I screamed loudly, my voice tearing through the sound of the heavy rain. I fiercely tightened my protective grip on Chloe. "I will scream. I will fight you. Do not take another step." Julian did not listen. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes still completely glued to Chloe's small, feverish face. One of the massive bodyguards, a man with a thick scar across his neck, aggressively moved toward me, reaching out his large hand as if to forcefully grab my shoulder. "Do not touch her!" I roared, pure, unadulterated maternal adrenaline violently flooding my veins. I was not a trained fighter. I was a corporate forensic accountant. But in that desperate, terrifying moment, I transformed into an absolute lioness. I violently kicked out with my right leg, forcefully connecting my hard boot with the guard's kneecap. He grunted in surprise and stumbled backward. Another guard aggressively lunged from my left blind spot. I sharply twisted my body fiercely, using my elbow to violently strike his jaw, while desperately keeping Chloe completely shielded against the solid brick wall. "Grab the woman, secure the perimeter," the scarred guard commanded loudly, recovering from my sudden kick. They closed in rapidly, their massive bodies completely blocking out the streetlights. They were highly trained professionals, and I was just one exhausted, freezing woman holding a sick child. I fiercely thrashed, violently kicking and wildly swinging my free arm, screaming at the top of my lungs. I managed to land a solid, heavy punch against another guard's chest, my knuckles burning with sharp pain. I was fully prepared to fight to the absolute bitter, bloody end. I would let them physically kill me before I ever let them forcefully take my daughter. "Stop!" The command was not just a shout. It was a violent guttural roar that completely shook the very air around us. Julian Davenport forcefully shoved his own heavily armed bodyguard out of his way with shocking aggressive strength. "Stand down right now." I said, "Stand down. Do not touch them." The highly trained guards instantly froze immediately, stepping back and lowering their raised hands, completely submitting to his absolute authority. I stood panting heavily, my chest heaving, my eyes wildly darting between the frozen guards and the imposing billionaire. I was ready to violently strike again if anyone twitched. The heavy rain continued to wash over us, washing away the blood from my scraped knuckles. Julian slowly raised his empty hands, keeping his palms clearly visible, showing he held no weapons. He was breathing just as heavily as I was, his chest rising and falling rapidly under his soaked designer suit. He took another slow, highly cautious step forward, exactly like a man approaching a highly dangerous, cornered wild animal. His intense eyes never left Chloe. His face was completely pale, washed out by the harsh headlights of the massive SUVs. He looked completely shattered, as if he had just seen a ghost walk out of the dark, freezing rain. I held my ground against the wet brick wall, my muscles completely coiled and violently trembling, ready for the absolute fight of my life. The freezing rain continued to violently batter the dark street, but Julian Davenport completely ignored the harsh elements. He slowly dropped to his knees right onto the cracked, flooded asphalt. The dirty water instantly soaked through the knees of his expensive tailored trousers, yet he did not even flinch. His entire universe had clearly narrowed down to the small, feverish girl shivering tightly against my chest. His dark eyes, previously described as cold and calculating, were now completely overflowing with raw, unfiltered emotion. Thick tears streamed freely down his sharp face, mingling seamlessly with the freezing rain. He raised his large, trembling hands and positioned them perfectly in the space between us. He did not speak a single verbal word. Instead, his long fingers moved with incredible, flawless grace, forming precise, highly articulate signs. He signed the word for beautiful. He signed the word for brave. He signed the exact specific phrase for my little bird. I felt a massive shockwave violently ripple through my entire body. Chloe, despite her incredibly high fever and deep exhaustion, suddenly lifted her heavy head from my wet shoulder. Her glassy eyes widened in absolute astonishment. She stared at the imposing billionaire kneeling in the dirty puddles. Slowly, her small, trembling hands detached from my soaked coat. She looked directly into Julian's weeping eyes and weakly signed back the word for Papa. The sound that violently ripped from Julian Davenport's throat was not a sob. It was a guttural, earth-shattering wail of a man who had his entire soul suddenly returned to his empty chest. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently under the pouring rain. His heavily armed guards remained absolutely motionless, completely silent witnesses to their ruthless employer completely breaking down on a dark, desolate street corner. I stood completely paralyzed against the wet brick wall, my mind desperately struggling to process the impossible reality unfolding directly in front of me. I had legally adopted Chloe from a severely underfunded, highly secretive state facility exactly 6 months ago. Her records had been completely blank, her origins entirely unknown. How could this globally feared billionaire possibly be her father? Julian finally raised his head, wiping the rain and tears from his face with the back of his hand. He looked at me, his eyes burning with an intense, overwhelming gratitude that completely disarmed my defensive posture. He slowly stood up, his tall frame towering over me, but his demeanor was entirely stripped of any threat. "She is my biological daughter," Julian said, his deep voice cracking heavily with raw emotion. "Her real name is Alara Davenport. Exactly 4 years ago, she completely vanished from her secure nursery in our heavily guarded estate. The local authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the highest-level international private investigators all definitively concluded that she was dead. They confidently told me she had perished in a highly tragic, completely unavoidable accident. But it was all a meticulously crafted, deeply malicious lie." He paused, his jaw clenching so tightly I could actually hear his teeth grinding together over the sound of the falling rain. My vindictive ex-wife and her highly corrupt, immensely powerful family deliberately staged the entire kidnapping. They brutally used my innocent daughter as the ultimate weapon to completely break me during our incredibly hostile corporate divorce. They intentionally placed her into the darkest corners of the anonymous foster system, actively paying off highly corrupt officials to permanently erase her identity and falsely declare her deceased. I felt a cold shiver violently run down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing rain. The sheer, unadulterated evil required to tear a disabled child from her father and erase her existence was completely unfathomable. I had spent every single waking moment of the last 4 years violently tearing the globe apart looking for her. Julian continued, his voice growing darker, heavier. I spent hundreds of millions of dollars chasing down endless false leads, completely destroying any criminal organization that dared to stand in my way. I completely refused to believe she was gone. My highly advanced facial recognition software, which actively scans global databases, finally caught a tiny, blurry fragment of her face on a random traffic camera near your accounting firm yesterday. We have been tracking your movements ever since. I thought you were part of the syndicate that took her. I thought you were one of the monsters. I looked down at Chloe, who had peacefully rested her head back against my shoulder. The fever-reducing medication finally starting to take effect. I am not a monster, I said softly, my voice completely steady, despite the freezing cold. I am just a forensic accountant who saw a beautiful, brilliant little girl completely abandoned in a broken system. I legally fought for months to finalize her adoption. I brought her into my home and I gave her absolutely everything I had. But everything I had was intentionally stolen from me exactly 3 days ago. Julian stepped slightly closer, his dark eyes analyzing my soaked clothes and exhausted face. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his tone instantly shifting, becoming noticeably sharper, far more analytical. I took a very deep, shuddering breath, the bitter reality of my absolute ruin flooding back into my mind. My own family. I stated clearly, refusing to look away from his piercing gaze. My father is Richard Davenport. My brother-in-law is Terrence, the man who runs the massive Apex hedge fund. They are completely obsessed with their flawless public image and their immense social standing. When I proudly brought Chloe to a major family gathering 3 days ago, my father issued a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. He demanded that I immediately return her to the state facility because a deaf child did not fit their perfect elevated narrative. He offered me a $10,000 bribe to walk away from my own daughter. Julian's eyes darkened instantly, a terrifying lethal storm brewing deep within his irises. "And you refused?" He stated a statement of absolute fact rather than a question. "I completely refused." I confirmed, lifting my chin defiantly. I told them their money and their legacy were completely bankrupt. So my father instantly retaliated. He permanently severed my access to the entire family trust. He completely froze every single one of my personal bank accounts. The very next morning, Terrence used his massive financial leverage to force my accounting firm to fire me without any severance. They completely stripped away my salary, my safety net, and my entire professional reputation in less than 24 hours. They intentionally forced me onto the street, hoping the crushing weight of absolute poverty would quickly force me to surrender Chloe. We are currently staying in that rundown motel across the street, because it is literally the only place I can afford with the last $40 in my pocket. I came out into this freezing storm tonight because she developed a dangerously high fever, and I had absolutely no other way to get her medication. The heavy rain seemed to suddenly stop as the sheer weight of my words hung heavily in the freezing air. The silence that followed was absolute and deeply terrifying. The 6 heavily armed bodyguards stood completely rigid, their faces entirely unreadable, but their posture radiating highly focused lethal intent. Julian Davenport slowly closed his eyes. He took a long, incredibly deep breath, expanding his broad chest. When he finally opened his eyes again, the weeping, broken father was completely gone. In his place stood the ruthless, globally feared billionaire kingmaker. The transformation was absolutely chilling. His entire demeanor radiated an immense, unstoppable, and highly destructive power. He slowly reached out and gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from Chloe's sleeping face. His touch was incredibly tender, a sharp contrast to the lethal energy radiating from his core. You sacrificed your entire family, your career, and your absolute livelihood to protect my daughter, Julian said, his dark voice dropping into a deadly, chilling register that easily cut through the howling wind. You stood your ground against wealthy, highly corrupt men who thought they could completely crush you into submission. You willingly accepted absolute ruin just to keep her safe. He slowly turned his intense, penetrating gaze back to my face. The sheer magnitude of his immense wealth and absolute global influence seemed to physically manifest in the dark street, completely suffocating the surrounding air. He stepped directly into my personal space, his eyes burning with an incredibly fierce, unwavering determination. Now I'm going to give you the absolute power to crush them. Before I could process his terrifying vow, the sharp, piercing ringtone of my cell phone violently shattered the intense, heavy silence. I pulled it from my pocket. The caller identification flashed brightly. It was Richard. He was calling me frantically, completely unaware of the highly dangerous kingmaker standing directly beside me. The bright screen of my cell phone glared through the freezing rain. Richard was calling me. I stared at his name, my thumb hovering over the accept button. Julian Davenport stepped closer and placed his large, warm hand completely over my shaking fingers. He gently pushed my phone down. "Do not answer that," he commanded softly. "Let them completely believe they have broken you. Let them blindly revel in their false victory tonight. Tomorrow I will gladly hand you the mighty hammer to shatter their entire glass castle." I slowly nodded, letting the persistent ringing finally fade into absolute silence. The scene drastically shifted the very next morning. The sun brightly illuminated the massive glass windows of the Davenport corporate headquarters. Inside the lavish penthouse boardroom, the atmosphere was utterly suffocating. Richard paced aggressively across the expensive hardwood floor, his face shining with thick, cold sweat. Terence sat heavily at the polished mahogany table, aggressively loosening his silk tie. His normally arrogant demeanor was entirely gone. His massive hedge fund was secretly hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single hour. The highly illegal offshore accounts I had recently discovered were violently collapsing. They were standing directly on the brink of ruin. Richard was equally desperate. His primary commercial real estate business was dangerously over-leveraged. He had carelessly borrowed massive sums of dirty money to quickly finance several highly unstable luxury developments. If Terence failed to quickly inject fresh capital, Richard would instantly default on every single massive loan. They absolutely needed a $50 million lifeline by the end of the week, or their entire fake empire would violently shatter. They had foolishly invited Julian here today, desperately hoping to completely charm the reclusive billionaire into saving their sinking ships. They honestly thought they were incredibly smart and highly persuasive. The heavy glass doors silently glided open. Julian strode into the tense boardroom, radiating an absolutely chilling, lethal authority. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that projected immense, unassailable power. Two massive, heavily armed security guards flanked him quickly, taking positions by the solid doors. Julian did not offer his hand to shake. He simply sat down at the very head of the polished table, completely plunging the opposite end of the room into deep, intimidating shadows. Richard instantly jumped forward hastily, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He flashed a brilliant, entirely fake smile at the quiet, seated billionaire. "Mr. Davenport, it is a profound honor to finally host you here," Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute sycophancy. Julian remained completely silent, his dark eyes analyzing Richard like a fascinating, highly repulsive insect. Terence quickly slid a thick, glossy presentation folder directly across the smooth table. "We have prepared a highly lucrative, exclusive investment opportunity for you today. Terrence stated, desperately trying to project ultimate confidence. A $50 million strategic partnership that will essentially guarantee enormous quarterly returns. Julian slowly leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, lightly tapping his long fingers against the dark polished wood. I do not simply invest blindly based on glossy paper, Julian said coldly. I strictly invest in absolute integrity. I invest in highly stable, truly honorable men. Tell me, Richard, what exactly defines your core corporate values? Richard immediately puffed out his chest, foolishly seizing the clear opportunity to falsely brag. Family, Richard proudly declared, placing his right hand over his heart. We are a perfect, loving, tightly knit family. That absolute loyalty directly translates to our incredibly secure business model. We unconditionally support our own. We fiercely protect our daughters. We never let anyone fall through the dark cracks. Julian stared at him from the dark shadows. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of Richard's fake speech was utterly sickening. Just 3 days ago, this exact man had brutally cast his own daughter out into the freezing rain, completely cutting her off, because she bravely chose to protect a disabled child. You fiercely protect your daughters, Julian repeated softly, his lethal tone dangerously quiet. Always Terrence eagerly agreed, aggressively nodding his head. My lovely wife Kendra and her sweet sister are the absolute center of our entire universe. We would sacrifice absolutely anything to ensure their lasting happiness and total safety. Julian's jaw violently clenched. The vivid memory of his tiny, feverish daughter violently shaking in the cold rain burned brightly in his sharp mind. The immense restraint required to simply not tear these pathetic men apart with his bare hands was absolutely staggering. However, Julian was a highly calculating kingmaker. He strictly dealt in absolute ruin, not brief emotional outbursts. He wanted them to willfully sign their own professional death warrants. Fascinating, Julian finally said, his lips curling into a deeply menacing shark-like smile. Your strong family values are exactly what I actively seek in my elite corporate partners. Richard audibly exhaled a massive breath of relief. Terrence visibly relaxed, a smug, greedy grin slowly spreading across his sweating face. They foolishly thought they had entirely succeeded. They absolutely believed the $50 million was fully secured. I will completely approve the $50 million injection immediately, Julian announced, watching their eager eyes brightly widen with unadulterated greed. However, my massive financial investment comes with one absolute non-negotiable condition. I demand total unprecedented transparency. I require a completely unannounced, ruthlessly thorough forensic audit of every single ledger, offshore holding, and shadow account currently controlled by your combined entities. Terrence hesitated for a brief fraction of a second. His dark shadow accounts were intensely vulnerable, but he arrogantly assumed no standard auditor could possibly crack his heavily encrypted financial webs in time. We gladly welcome your extensive audit, Terrence proudly lied. Our firm operates with total absolute transparency. We clearly have absolutely nothing to hide from your esteemed corporate team. Richard vigorously nodded in total agreement. We will easily sign whatever extensive authorizations your team strictly requires today. We completely embrace your brilliant oversight. Julian smoothly pulled a thick binding legal contract directly from his dark tailored suit jacket. He placed the crisp white pages flat onto the polished mahogany table. This highly specific legal document formally grants my newly appointed Special Vice President absolute unrestricted access to every single server, digital vault, and private ledger you currently possess. Julian stated, his cold voice echoing sharply off the high glass walls. By willingly signing this binding contract, you automatically waive all standard corporate privacy rights. The forensic audit begins immediately upon signature. If my vice president discovers any illicit laundering or hidden fraud, my $50 million capital injection will instantly convert into a complete hostile corporate takeover bid. Richard and Terrence barely scanned the extensive legal phrasing. The intense, blinding desperation for Julian's massive cash injection completely overshadowed any lingering rational caution. They were entirely blinded by their own mounting greed and immediate financial terror. Terrence aggressively snatched a heavy silver pen from the table and quickly signed his name across the bottom line. Richard immediately followed, frantically scribbling his signature with trembling, eager hands. They had absolutely no idea they were actively digging their own deep graves. They had willfully handed the undisputed kingmaker the exact lethal tools needed to permanently dismantle their entire corrupt family empire. "Excellent," Julian said softly, quickly sliding the heavily signed contracts back into his sleek jacket. "You have both made an incredibly wise corporate decision today. My special vice president will happily arrive shortly to effectively begin the exhaustive audit process. I strongly suggest you grant her complete total cooperation." Terrence confidently smirked, forcefully adjusting his expensive tie. "We will happily show your esteemed executive exactly how a truly successful portfolio runs," Terrence boldly bragged. "We practically guarantee she will be absolutely astounded by our flawless numbers." Julian merely nodded, his dark eyes shining with cold, deeply terrifying, absolutely lethal amusement. "I am absolutely certain she will uncover the exact truth," Julian stated quietly. The heavy double doors instantly swung open again. The two massive security guards quickly stepped aside, perfectly clearing a wide path for the newly appointed executive. Terrence leaned forward expectantly, waiting to cordially greet the incoming auditor. Richard stood up tall, preparing another fake, obsequious smile. The loud, rhythmic clicking of sharp heels echoed menacingly down the polished marble corridor. Every single footstep sounded like a heavy nail being violently driven directly into a solid wooden coffin. The atmosphere inside the bright boardroom suddenly grew freezing cold. I slowly stepped into the large glass room. I wore a sharply tailored designer suit Julian had graciously provided. I securely held the exact same high-capacity thumb drive I had successfully loaded with Terrence's heavily encrypted fraud data. Richard's fake smile completely vanished. His jaw violently dropped. Terrence's face instantly drained of all visible color. They stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror. They suddenly realized they had completely signed their massive empires entirely away to the precise woman they had violently discarded. I looked directly into Terrence's terrified eyes and offered a very cold, deeply menacing final smile. I looked directly into Terrence's terrified eyes and offered a very cold, deeply menacing final smile. The heavy glass doors of the massive boardroom slid silently shut, instantly severing my former family from the outside world. I did not speak another word to them. They were entirely trapped in a corporate cage of their own making. Julian Davenport smoothly turned and gestured for me to follow his lead. We walked briskly away from the quiet executive suite and moved deep into the highly secure, heavily guarded center of his vast corporate headquarters. He had kept his incredible life-altering promise. He had willingly handed me the absolute power to systematically destroy the exact people who had carelessly discarded my beautiful daughter. We stepped into a private elevator that rapidly ascended to the very top floor. The steel doors opened to reveal a sprawling, incredibly advanced corner office, boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that completely overlooked the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The sleek, modern room was lined with massive, ultra-high-definition monitors and powerful server banks. "This is your private digital fortress," Julian stated quietly, his dark eyes fierce with unwavering determination. "You have completely unlimited, highly privileged access to my entire global intelligence network. My top cybersecurity engineers are standing by to execute your exact commands. Tear their fake empire apart, Aaliyah. Leave absolutely nothing standing." He turned and quietly exited the room, leaving me completely alone with the most advanced financial weaponry on the planet. I slowly walked toward the massive glass desk and sat down in the ergonomic leather chair. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small digital thumb drive. This tiny piece of plastic contained the dark, corrupt souls of Richard and Terrence. I firmly plugged the drive directly into the secure terminal. The massive wall monitors instantly flared to life, casting a sharp, clinical blue glow across the quiet room. My fingers immediately began flying rapidly across the illuminated mechanical keyboard. I aggressively bypassed the initial firewall protocols, flawlessly integrating Terrence's heavily encrypted files straight into Julian's incredibly powerful decryption matrix. The Davenport servers were absolute monsters. They processed the highly complex algorithmic data billions of times faster than my old firm's severely outdated equipment. Within mere minutes, the seemingly impenetrable digital walls completely shattered, fully exposing Terrence's darkest secrets. I systematically began unraveling the massive, highly convoluted financial web. Terrence had always aggressively projected the flawless image of a highly brilliant, entirely untouchable Wall Street prodigy. He constantly bragged about his aggressive market strategies, his massive yacht, and his unparalleled quarterly returns. The reality glaring brightly back at me on the digital screens was infinitely darker and utterly pathetic. Terrence was not a financial genius at all. He was a desperate, incredibly sloppy thief. I meticulously traced the digital footprints of his massive international wire transfers, ruthlessly cutting through layer upon layer of fake offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The sheer scale of his aggressive fraud was absolutely staggering. His primary hedge fund was entirely bankrupt. He had suffered catastrophic, irrecoverable losses in highly leveraged international tech stocks several months ago. To desperately cover his massive, rapidly bleeding deficits, he had completely abandoned any lingering pretense of ethical investing. He had violently crossed the line from poor market speculation directly into aggressive, highly predatory embezzlement. I followed a massive chain of heavily disguised transactions directly back to their original source. My stomach violently churned with profound, unadulterated disgust. Terrence was not simply stealing money from other wealthy billionaires or massive faceless corporate entities. He was actively siphoning millions of dollars directly from vulnerable municipal pension funds. He was systematically robbing retired public school teachers, elderly city workers, and aging firefighters of their entire life savings. He had brilliantly created a highly complex, completely automated skimming algorithm that silently drained these modest retirement accounts fraction by tiny fraction. He routed the stolen money straight into his failing hedge fund to artificially inflate his monthly returns and maintain his lavish, disgusting lifestyle. It was an incredibly vile, deeply cowardly crime. He was intentionally destroying the fragile livelihoods of thousands of innocent, hardworking people merely to sustain his arrogant vanity. I aggressively copied every single piece of undeniable evidence. I perfectly compiled the digital wire transfers, the fake corporate identities, and his explicit internal emails directly authorizing the massive theft. Terrence was completely finished. He would not just face total public bankruptcy and ultimate social humiliation. He was going directly to federal prison for a very long time. But the deep corruption did not end with Terrence. I immediately shifted my intense burning focus over to Richard. My father had always loudly preached about absolute fiscal responsibility, forcefully demanding total perfection from everyone around him. He ruled his commercial real estate empire with a brutal iron fist, completely crushing anyone who dared to question his supreme authority. I ruthlessly sliced through his heavily guarded corporate ledgers, aggressively matching his massive company assets directly against his sprawling, hidden list of aggressive liabilities. The true financial picture was absolutely catastrophic. Richard's primary development company was completely suffocating under an enormous, crushing mountain of toxic unpaid debt. He had aggressively overextended himself on 3 massive luxury high-rises in downtown Atlanta, completely ignoring all basic economic market indicators. When those unstable projects inevitably failed, his highly aggressive corporate creditors had come calling for their money. To desperately avoid a total corporate collapse and immense public humiliation, Richard had frantically turned to Terrence for a massive cash injection, but Terrence was already actively drowning in his own criminal embezzlement scheme and could not provide clean capital. So Richard committed the ultimate act of desperate, unforgivable fraud. I rapidly pulled up the highly secure digital property records for the sweeping family mansion. The massive historic estate had been completely paid off for decades. It was the absolute crown jewel of the Davenport family legacy, the ultimate untouchable symbol of their immense wealth and overwhelming social power. But the newly downloaded corporate records showed something completely different. Exactly 2 months ago, a massive, highly suspicious $30 million commercial mortgage had been quietly placed entirely against the family estate. I meticulously analyzed the heavy loan documents, zooming in closely on the digital signatures required to execute the massive lien. My blood turned completely to ice. Richard had fully forged my mother's signature on every single legal document. He had secretly leveraged the entire family home, literally risking the absolute roof over their heads, to desperately cover Terrence's violent margin calls and keep their fake crumbling empire temporarily afloat. He had committed massive wire fraud and felony forgery, completely destroying the family's true wealth while aggressively demanding that I abandon my deaf daughter to supposedly protect their prestigious, spotless legacy. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his actions was completely nauseating. I methodically saved every single forged document, every illegal wire transfer, and every desperate internal memo. I carefully assembled an absolutely bulletproof, incredibly lethal digital dossier. The executioner's blade was perfectly sharp and entirely ready to drop. While I sat in the cold blue glow of the massive monitors actively preparing their total destruction, my mother Vivian and my older sister Kendra were aggressively preparing for the social event of the entire Atlanta season. The annual Jack and Jill Gala was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday evening at the incredibly lavish Ritz-Carlton Hotel downtown. It was the absolute pinnacle of elite, high society networking. Every single wealthy, influential family would be proudly walking the bright red carpet completely draped in expensive imported diamonds and tailored silk tuxedos. Vivian and Kendra were currently holding court inside an exclusive, highly restrictive bridal boutique, completely surrounded by dozens of terrified, frantic retail assistants. Vivian stood proudly on a circular fitting pedestal, carefully examining her reflection in a massive gilded mirror. She was trying on a custom, incredibly expensive emerald green gown, heavily encrusted with thousands of imported Swarovski crystals. Kendra sat lazily on a plush velvet sofa nearby, aggressively sipping complimentary expensive champagne while completely ignoring her highly demanding children. They were absolutely vibrating with pure, unchecked, overwhelming arrogance. Richard had quickly called them directly from his intense boardroom meeting earlier that morning. He had gleefully informed them that Julian Davenport, the absolute kingmaker of the global corporate world, was actively considering a massive $50 million investment in their struggling family business. He had deliberately hidden the terrifying reality of the mandatory, unrestricted forensic audit. He had proudly claimed that Julian was completely captivated by their flawless, highly elevated family image and wanted to aggressively partner with them. "This grand gala is going to be our absolute, undeniable coronation," Vivian loudly declared, aggressively swatting away a nervous retail assistant who dared to gently touch her expensive hemline. "When Julian Davenport publicly announces his massive financial partnership with us this weekend, every single person in this city will finally bow down. We will officially be completely untouchable." Kendra laughed loudly, a sharp, highly grating sound that perfectly mirrored her remarkably ugly soul. "Terrence is already aggressively looking at purchasing a brand new private jet." Kendra proudly bragged, taking another heavy, greedy gulp of champagne. "That $50 million is going to instantly elevate us into the absolute highest echelon of global wealth. We are finally leaving all the pathetic, weak people completely behind us forever." She smiled cruelly, her eyes shining with absolute malice, clearly thinking about me and Chloe out in the freezing rain. "Aaliyah is probably crying in some filthy, disgusting gutter right now. She deliberately chose to be a complete loser. We chose to be absolute royalty." They were completely blinded by their own massive, fragile egos and insatiable, bottomless greed. They firmly believed Saturday night would be their ultimate, glorious, unmatched triumph. They were meticulously planning their grand red carpet entrance, eagerly rehearsing their fake, highly polished smiles for the flashing paparazzi cameras. They had absolutely no idea that the silent trap had already been fully triggered. They truly believed Julian Davenport was coming to the lavish Ritz-Carlton gala to happily crown them as undeniable corporate royalty. They did not realize he was actively coming to the gala to publicly execute their entire fraudulent legacy. They had absolutely no idea that the guillotine was already falling, and I was exactly the one happily pulling the heavy lever to entirely wipe them from existence. They had absolutely no idea that the guillotine was already falling, and I was exactly the one happily pulling the heavy lever to entirely wipe them from existence. Saturday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that completely blanketed the sprawling city of Atlanta. Inside my highly secure, incredibly luxurious suite at the Davenport Hotel, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was cool, incredibly calm, and utterly completely focused. I sat quietly at the massive marble dining table, smoothly sipping a steaming cup of dark coffee. I was meticulously reviewing the incredibly damning, totally undeniable digital forensic files I had flawlessly compiled over the last 48 hours. Every single illegal wire transfer, every highly forged mortgage document, and every deeply predatory embezzlement record was perfectly organized, highly categorized, and absolutely ready for immediate deployment. I had successfully transformed their massive dark financial sins into a highly lethal, completely unstoppable digital weapon. My incredibly peaceful solitude was suddenly shattered by the sharp, highly irritating chime of my newly issued cell phone. I slowly picked up the sleek device from the cold marble table. The bright screen prominently displayed a new message from my older sister. Kendra had arrogantly sent a high-resolution, glaringly bright photograph directly to my private number. The image aggressively showcased her standing proudly inside her incredibly lavish, highly excessive dressing room. She was modeling an absurdly expensive, custom-tailored emerald green designer dress. The heavy silk fabric was completely covered in thousands of sparkling, highly reflective imported crystals. The massive price tag of exactly $15,000 was deliberately left highly visible, dangling carelessly from the delicate lace sleeve. Beneath the incredibly obnoxious, highly arrogant photograph was a short, deeply vicious text message. Her toxic, incredibly hateful words practically burned through the digital screen. Do not even think about showing your face near the Ritz-Carlton tonight to beg. Trash isn't allowed past the lobby. I stared intensely at the highly toxic message for a long, quiet moment. A few days ago, those incredibly cruel, deeply malicious words would have completely shattered my fragile heart. They would have caused immense, overwhelming emotional pain and brought heavy, bitter tears to my exhausted eyes. But today, they elicited an entirely different reaction. I did not feel sad, and I certainly did not feel broken. Instead, I felt a deep, incredibly powerful surge of cold, absolute amusement violently flood my veins. A slow, highly genuine, incredibly dangerous smile smoothly spread across my face. I gently tapped the side button of the sleek device, completely powering the phone down and entirely severing her toxic, arrogant voice from my peaceful reality. I smoothly tossed the dark, silent phone onto the massive marble table. They honestly believed they had completely won. They entirely thought I was totally defeated, violently crushed under the massive, heavy weight of their immense wealth and deep cruelty. They were incredibly, hopelessly wrong. I slowly stood up and confidently walked directly toward the massive, brightly illuminated dressing room, located at the far end of the luxurious suite. Julian Davenport had generously provided absolutely everything I could possibly need for this specific, highly critical evening. He understood perfectly that tonight was not simply a high society social event. Tonight was a brutal, completely unforgiving corporate execution, and I absolutely needed to dress the part of the ruthless executioner. A team of elite, highly discreet stylists had quietly arrived hours earlier to completely transform my exhausted, battered appearance into an image of absolute, undeniable power. I gently pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped directly in front of the massive, floor-to-ceiling trifold mirrors. I stood completely breathless, quietly staring at my own stunning, totally unrecognizable reflection. The highly skilled stylist had completely worked a massive, undeniable miracle. My dark hair was perfectly swept up into a sleek, incredibly elegant, highly sophisticated style that proudly showcased the sharp, strong lines of my jaw and neck. But it was the incredible, breathtaking gown that completely stole the air from the room. It was a custom-made, flawlessly tailored masterpiece of deep, midnight black silk. The incredibly rich, highly luxurious fabric gracefully draped across my body like a dark, liquid shadow. It featured a sharp, dangerously elegant neckline and a sweeping, dramatic train that completely demanded absolute, unwavering attention. The incredibly dark, rich color perfectly symbolized the absolute ruin I was bringing directly to my corrupt family. Julian had also thoughtfully provided a stunning, incredibly valuable diamond necklace that rested coldly against my collarbone. The massive, flawless stones caught the bright dressing room lights, casting sharp, brilliant reflections across the room. I did not look like a broken, desperate accountant begging for loose change. I looked like an incredibly wealthy, utterly untouchable queen, preparing to rightfully reclaim her stolen throne. I was a beautiful, incredibly sharp weapon, perfectly forged and entirely ready to strike. The scene aggressively shifted to the incredibly opulent, highly exclusive grand ballroom of the famous Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The massive, sprawling room was a stunning, glittering sea of absolute, undeniable wealth and immense social power. Enormous, highly intricate crystal chandeliers cast a bright golden glow over hundreds of elite, highly influential guests. Waiters in crisp, spotless white tuxedos smoothly circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays completely loaded with expensive vintage champagne and rare, delicate caviar. The air was heavily thick with the overwhelming sense of expensive designer perfumes and the loud, constant hum of arrogant, highly privileged conversations. At the very center of this massive, glittering universe stood my deeply corrupt, incredibly toxic family. They were completely holding court aggressively, commanding the absolute center of attention with their loud, obnoxious boasting. Richard Davenport stood incredibly tall, his chest puffed out aggressively under his sharp, custom-tailored tuxedo. He loudly swirled a heavy glass of incredibly expensive scotch, enthusiastically bragging to a large captive circle of wealthy Atlanta developers. He was aggressively hyping up the massive incoming $50 million capital injection, completely acting as if he had personally conquered the entire global market. Terrence stood right beside him, sweating slightly, but smiling broadly, loudly discussing his fake, entirely fabricated hedge fund returns with several incredibly powerful, highly influential city politicians. They were completely selling the massive, elaborate lie, totally convinced their incredibly dark, deeply illegal financial sins were permanently hidden. Vivian and Kendra were actively dominating the social elite on the other side of the massive ballroom. Vivian wore her incredibly expensive, highly structured designer gown, proudly flashing her heavy diamond rings to a small group of wealthy, highly jealous socialites. She loudly complained about the high costs of maintaining their massive historic family estate, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that Richard had secretly fraudulently mortgaged it to the absolute brink of total foreclosure. Kendra stood directly next to her, proudly wearing the exact $15,000 emerald green crystal dress she had arrogantly texted me about earlier. She loudly laughed at a terrible joke, aggressively sipping her champagne and proudly displaying her massive, incredibly flashy engagement ring. They were absolutely thriving in their fake, totally fabricated kingdom, entirely believing they were the absolute, undisputed rulers of the entire Atlanta social scene. The heavy, incredibly ornate mahogany doors of the grand ballroom were currently closed, completely sealing the elite, highly exclusive event from the outside world. The loud, arrogant conversations, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the soft, elegant music from the live string quartet created a constant, overwhelming wall of sound. Richard loudly proclaimed that the Davenport family legacy was absolutely stronger, incredibly wealthier, and entirely more powerful than ever before. He aggressively raised his heavy glass in a proud, totally obnoxious toast to their massive incoming fortune. Terrence quickly joined the loud toast, his greedy eyes shining with absolute, unchecked arrogance. They were completely ready to publicly announce their massive historic partnership with the legendary Julian Davenport. Suddenly, the heavy, incredibly massive mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom violently swung open. The heavy wood hit the stops with a loud, sharp crack that instantly echoed across the entire sprawling space. The sudden aggressive movement instantly caught the attention of the highly trained security personnel standing nearby. The live string quartet immediately faltered, the musicians completely losing their rhythm as they stared at the main entrance. The loud, constant wall of arrogant conversation began to rapidly die down, violently rippling outward from the heavy doors, like a massive silent wave completely washing over the glittering crowd. I stepped directly into the bright, overwhelming light of the grand ballroom. I stood completely alone. I did not have a wealthy escort, and I certainly did not have a highly armed security detail. I absolutely did not need them. I paused perfectly at the very top of the short carpeted staircase that led down into the massive sprawling room. The bright, incredibly powerful light from the massive crystal chandeliers immediately caught the flawless diamonds resting heavily around my neck, casting sharp, brilliant flashes of pure light across the room. The midnight black silk of my custom gown pooled beautifully around my feet, creating an incredibly striking, deeply dramatic silhouette against the bright red carpet. I slowly lifted my chin, completely squaring my shoulders as I looked out over the massive, entirely silent sea of wealthy faces. The entire room had gone completely, absolutely dead silent. The sudden, incredibly heavy quiet was absolutely deafening. Every single eye in the massive room was completely locked directly onto me. The wealthy developers slowly lowered their expensive scotch glasses. The highly influential politicians completely stopped talking. The jealous socialites openly stared in absolute, unadulterated shock. I slowly, purposefully shifted my gaze across the massive silent room until I found the exact specific target I was looking for. My eyes locked completely and entirely onto my family. Richard stood totally frozen, his heavy glass of scotch suspended awkwardly in midair, his face rapidly draining of all visible color. Terrence's smug, greedy smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered, absolute terror. Vivian's jaw literally dropped, her heavy diamond rings completely forgotten as she stared at my breathtaking, incredibly powerful transformation. And Kendra, wearing her $15,000 emerald dress, looked absolutely entirely sick to her stomach. The arrogant, hateful words she had viciously texted me hours earlier hung silently in the air, completely destroyed by my undeniable, incredibly powerful presence. I offered them a slow, incredibly cold, deeply lethal smile, entirely ready to completely unleash the absolute storm they had so foolishly provoked. The profound, breathless silence in the massive ballroom hung heavily for exactly 10 agonizing seconds. Then the incredibly fragile, carefully constructed illusion of my family's supreme confidence violently shattered. Vivian and Kendra practically shoved their way through the paralyzed, glittering crowd. Their faces, previously flushed with arrogant, unchecked triumph, were now completely pale with unadulterated, blinding rage. The heavy, stiff silk of Vivian's incredibly expensive gown rustled aggressively as she stomped directly toward the carpeted staircase. Kendra followed closely behind her, her knuckles turning completely white as she tightly clutched a massive, overflowing crystal glass of incredibly dark red wine. Her emerald green designer dress, the exact same $15,000 garment she had proudly texted me about earlier, suddenly looked absolutely cheap against the pure, seething malice, violently twisting her sharp features. They looked exactly like cornered, incredibly desperate animals, completely terrified of a sudden powerful apex predator invading their highly exclusive, deeply protected territory. I remained standing perfectly still at the top of the stairs, my posture completely straight, my expression incredibly calm. I watched their frantic, utterly panicked approach with cold, deeply detached fascination. The elite guests quickly stepped back completely, clearing a wide, incredibly tense path for the impending collision. Whispers rapidly ignited across the massive room, a sudden, loud hissing sound that completely replaced the elegant string music. The wealthy developers and influential politicians eagerly leaned in their greedy eyes, completely locked on the unfolding, highly dramatic spectacle. Kendra reached the bottom of the short staircase, first her chest heaving violently with raw, unchecked fury. She looked up at my flawless midnight black silk gown and the incredibly heavy, flawless diamonds resting perfectly against my collarbone. The sheer, undeniable reality of my immense, towering presence completely short-circuited her fragile, highly arrogant brain. She could not comprehend how the sister she had viciously discarded into the freezing, unforgiving rain was now completely eclipsing her entirely. Instead of using words, she chose absolute, deliberate violence. Kendra aggressively lunged forward, her expensive high heels intentionally twisting against the soft, thick carpet. She loudly shrieked, executing a highly exaggerated, completely fake trip. As she forcefully threw her body forward, she violently jerked her right arm intentionally, hurling the entire glass of dark red wine directly toward the bottom of my pristine, custom-tailored gown. The dark liquid flew through the bright, heavily illuminated air in a massive, destructive arc. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply shifted my weight slightly, executing a smooth, incredibly precise turn. The heavy dark wine completely missed the delicate silk fabric of my expensive dress. Instead, the dark liquid violently splashed heavily against the pristine white marble floor, aggressively splattering directly back onto the lower half of Kendra's incredibly expensive $15,000 emerald green gown. Kendra looked down at the massive, dark, incredibly ugly stains completely ruining her precious designer dress. A high-pitched, absolutely ear-piercing screech violently erupted from her throat, completely shattering the remaining heavy tension in the grand ballroom. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "Get out of here right now!" Kendra roared loudly, her voice completely devoid of any high society elegance. "You do not belong here. You are nothing but pathetic, disgusting trash." Vivian instantly joined the aggressive, highly public attack, her face completely contorted with profound, ugly hatred. "How dare you show your pathetic face in this exclusive venue?" Vivian loudly demanded, completely ignoring the hundreds of shocked, highly influential guests openly staring at her public meltdown. "You have absolutely no money and zero social standing. You are completely ruining our perfect historic evening. Leave immediately before I personally throw you out into the street where you absolutely belong." Terrence aggressively pushed his way through the large crowd, completely abandoning his fake, highly polished Wall Street persona. His expensive suit was rumpled and his forehead shined with thick, cold sweat. He frantically signaled the large group of heavily armed hotel security guards standing near the main entrance. "Officers, remove this unhinged woman immediately," Terrence commanded loudly, aggressively waving his arms to ensure the entire wealthy room heard his desperate, highly panicked lies. "She is a completely homeless, highly dangerous trespasser who has deliberately snuck past your security checkpoints," Terrence continued to loudly declare, aggressively pointing his heavy hand directly at me. "She is violently harassing my innocent family. Escort her out of this prestigious building right now and immediately call the local police." The large, highly trained security guards quickly exchanged highly uncertain, incredibly hesitant glances. They looked closely at my flawless, custom-tailored midnight silk gown and the incredibly rare, highly expensive diamonds resting heavily around my neck. They immediately recognized that I completely belonged in this elite, highly exclusive environment, far more than the loudly screaming, deeply erratic family aggressively demanding my immediate removal. They remained absolutely frozen in place, entirely refusing to follow Terrence's desperate, unhinged orders. Then Richard Davenport finally stepped directly into the spotlight. He aggressively shoved Terrence aside, taking absolute control of the incredibly tense, highly public confrontation. He stood at the bottom of the carpeted stairs, looking up at me with eyes filled with pure, unadulterated, cold-blooded disgust. He desperately needed to completely crush me into immediate submission to quickly protect his fragile, heavily leveraged fake corporate empire. "You are an absolute undeniable disgrace to the Davenport name," Richard stated loudly, his deep, incredibly cruel voice easily carrying across the massive, utterly silent grand ballroom. Every single influential guest leaned forward eagerly, hanging on to his incredibly vicious, highly toxic words. "You are a completely defective product," Richard declared coldly, intentionally, using the most degrading, highly corporate term he could possibly imagine. "You willingly threw away your incredibly privileged life to raise a broken, completely useless, disabled child. You actively chose the gutter over our pristine, historic family legacy. So I am making this absolutely, completely official in front of the most powerful, highly respected families in Atlanta. I entirely, completely disown you. You are absolutely no longer a Davenport. You are completely dead to this family, and you are entirely dead to this entire city. Now turn around, walk back out those heavy doors, and crawl directly back into the pathetic, freezing poverty you aggressively chose." His incredibly vicious, highly public execution was designed to completely break my spirit, to violently force me to my knees in front of the entire high society elite. He truly believed his incredibly harsh, deeply toxic words still held absolute, unquestionable power over my fragile soul. He honestly thought I would completely shatter, loudly burst into heavy, pathetic tears, and quickly run away in absolute, undeniable shame. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not shed a single solitary tear. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not break my incredibly straight, highly confident posture. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the four desperate, deeply corrupt individuals completely melting down on the bright red carpet. The heavy, overwhelming silence quickly returned to the massive, glittering ballroom, completely replacing the loud, aggressive echoes of Richard's highly toxic, incredibly vile speech. I slowly raised my left wrist with incredible, flawless elegance. I deliberately pulled back the smooth, dark silk sleeve of my custom-tailored gown. I calmly checked the incredibly rare, highly expensive, custom diamond watch wrapped perfectly around my wrist. The bright, highly polished hands ticked quietly, completely counting down the final, highly absolute seconds of their fake, entirely fabricated kingdom. I slowly lowered my arm and looked directly into Richard's deeply hateful, incredibly terrified eyes. I did not look at him with anger or deep burning rage. I looked at him and the rest of my deeply corrupt, incredibly toxic family with absolute, completely chilling, unadulterated pity. They were incredibly small, highly pathetic, utterly desperate people who had absolutely no idea that the massive heavy blade was already falling directly toward their exposed necks. "You possess an incredibly vivid, highly active imagination," Richard Verste stated calmly, my cold, incredibly smooth voice easily projecting across the massive, completely silent room. "But your massive, deeply fraudulent empire of massive debt, illegal mortgages, and highly toxic embezzlement is completely, entirely finished." I offered them one final, incredibly cold, deeply menacing smile. "You have exactly 3 minutes left to proudly enjoy this grand, completely pathetic illusion of wealth," I stated quietly, absolutely shattering their false reality. "You have exactly 3 minutes before my boss arrives." The ultimate, totally absolute destruction of the Davenport legacy was rapidly, completely approaching now. Their deeply arrogant, totally hollow reign was completely, definitively over. They would finally face the absolute, undeniable consequences of their incredibly dark, incredibly vicious, completely unforgivable actions tonight. They had absolutely no idea that Julian Davenport himself was confidently walking directly through the massive lobby doors at this exact, precise second. The entire room remained entirely still, completely captivated by the immense, devastating power I completely radiated without shedding a single solitary pathetic tear. The heavy, agonizing seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. The air in the grand ballroom grew incredibly thick, suffocating everyone present. Every single eye remained firmly locked on my composed, unyielding figure. The absolute silence was unnatural, an incredibly dense vacuum of sound that completely swallowed the usual high society chatter. Richard stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. Terrence shifted his weight nervously, sweat actively pouring down his forehead. Vivian and Kendra stood entirely paralyzed, their faces twisted into ugly masks of pure, burning hatred. They were waiting for me to break, fully expecting my imminent total collapse. They truly believed I was simply a desperate, completely powerless woman staging a pathetic, final act of defiance. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to be violently, permanently upended. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous boom echoed across the sprawling space. The incredibly heavy, intricately carved mahogany double doors at the main entrance were thrown violently open. The sheer force of the impact sent a physical shockwave rippling through the glittering elite crowd. The heavy doors slammed loudly against the marble walls, instantly shattering the suffocating silence. A powerful, blinding surge of bright light spilled directly into the ballroom from the outer lobby. The entire room collectively gasped rapidly, turning their heads toward the grand entrance. The highly anticipated moment of absolute reckoning had finally arrived. Julian Davenport stepped confidently through the massive doorway. He did not simply enter the room, he entirely commanded it. He radiated an aura of supreme, absolute authority that completely dwarfed every other wealthy individual present. He wore a flawlessly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly accentuated his imposing, incredibly powerful frame. His expression was cold, sharp, and entirely unreadable. He moved with the smooth, calculated grace of an apex predator entering a cage full of frightened prey. He was the undisputed king of the global corporate world, a man who possessed the terrifying absolute power to effortlessly make or break massive international empires with a single simple gesture. He did not arrive alone. A highly trained elite security team marched in perfect silent unison behind him. 6 massive, heavily armed men dressed in identical dark suits fanned out rapidly, immediately securing the perimeter of the grand entrance. Their eyes scanned the wealthy crowd with cold, clinical precision, completely neutralizing any potential threat before it could even materialize. The elite guests instinctively shrank back, completely terrified by the sudden, overwhelming display of absolute physical and financial dominance. But the most stunning, completely breathtaking part of Julian's dramatic arrival was not the heavily armed guards or his own immense, intimidating presence. It was the tiny, incredibly precious figure walking proudly directly by his side. My beautiful daughter Chloe stepped into the bright light of the grand ballroom. She looked absolutely, completely radiant. Julian had spared absolutely no expense for her grand debut. She was wearing a stunning, custom-designed princess gown that looked like it had been pulled directly from a fairy tale. The delicate, incredibly expensive fabric was a soft, shimmering shade of pale pink, completely covered in thousands of tiny, sparkling pearls that caught the light with every single step she took. A delicate, sparkling tiara rested perfectly in her dark hair. She held tightly onto Julian's large hand, her small face glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. She was completely deaf to the sudden loud gasps of the shocked crowd, entirely insulated from the toxic, venomous atmosphere of the room. She was an absolute vision of pure, innocent grace. Seeing her there looking so incredibly beautiful and entirely safe completely filled my heart with overwhelming, undeniable power. She was the absolute reason I was standing in this room. She was the pure, innocent soul my incredibly corrupt family had viciously, carelessly discarded. They had actively labeled her a defect, a massive liability to their prestigious, flawless image. Now, she was walking proudly into their exclusive, highly restricted world, holding the hand of the single most powerful man on the planet. The sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere of the grand ballroom was incredibly violent. The sheer, overwhelming realization of Julian Davenport's physical presence completely overwhelmed my family's collective brain. The deep, blinding rage that had entirely consumed their features just seconds ago instantly, completely vanished. It was rapidly replaced by a desperate, highly pathetic, deeply sickening display of pure, unadulterated greed. They entirely forgot about my existence. They completely abandoned their vicious, highly public attack on me. Their fragile egos instantly pivoted, completely drawn to the massive, glowing beacon of Julian's immense wealth and power. They truly, honestly believed he was walking through those doors to officially save them, to proudly announce the massive $50 million partnership that would completely rescue their failing, highly leveraged empire. Richard was the very first to react. His posture completely changed instantly, transforming from an arrogant, cruel dictator into a desperate, groveling sycophant. He quickly smoothed his rumpled tuxedo jacket, pasted a massive, entirely fake smile onto his sweating face, and rushed eagerly toward the grand entrance. Terence immediately followed, practically tripping over his own expensive shoes in his absolute pathetic haste to greet his supposed corporate savior. Vivian and Kendra completely abandoned their aggressive stance, their faces instantly stretching into wide, incredibly desperate, highly artificial grins. They shoved their way aggressively through the crowd of elite guests, desperate to be at the very front of the welcoming committee. "Ah, Mr. Davenport, what an absolute incredible honor it is to finally have you here tonight!" Richard loudly exclaimed, his voice dripping with thick, highly nauseating flattery. He practically bowed as he approached, eagerly extending his right hand for a firm, enthusiastic handshake. "We have been eagerly anticipating your grand arrival. This is a truly historic, incredibly monumental evening for the Davenport legacy. We are so incredibly thrilled to officially welcome you to our celebration." Terence quickly chimed in, his voice slightly breathless from his frantic, desperate sprint across the ballroom floor. "Yes, sir, an absolute privilege. Our firm is completely, entirely ready to execute the final partnership documents. We are incredibly excited to merge our massive resources with your esteemed global network." He offered a wide, incredibly fake smile, his greedy eyes completely locked onto Julian's imposing figure. Vivian pushed herself forcefully to the front, completely ignoring the fact that her incredibly expensive designer gown was still slightly rumpled. "Mr. Davenport, you look absolutely dashing this evening," she purred loudly, her voice dripping with artificial, highly practiced high society charm. "We are so completely overjoyed you could join our exclusive event. And who is this absolutely charming, precious little girl you have brought with you?" Kendra stood right beside her mother, her $15,000 emerald green dress completely stained with the dark red wine she had clumsily spilled. She offered a wide, incredibly eager smile, desperately trying to project an image of flawless, polished elegance, despite her utterly ruined appearance. "We are so incredibly honored to host you, sir," she added quickly, her voice dripping with desperation. They stood there in a tight, highly pathetic cluster, their hands eagerly outstretched, their faces completely frozen in identical, totally artificial masks of desperate joy. They were completely, entirely blind to the cold, hard reality of the situation. They honestly believed they were about to be crowned as undisputed corporate royalty. They had absolutely no idea that their entire, corrupt world was about to completely implode. Julian Davenport did not smile. He did not slow his confident, incredibly powerful stride. He did not even acknowledge their desperate, pathetic existence with a single fleeting glance. His expression remained absolutely, completely carved from solid ice. He moved forward with unstoppable, completely terrifying momentum. As Richard eagerly thrust his hand forward, Julian simply walked directly past him. He completely, utterly ignored the outstretched hand, treating Richard with the exact same level of dismissive indifference one might show to a minor, highly irritating insect. Richard's fake, eager smile instantly froze. His outstretched hand hung uselessly in the cold air. Terence gasped softly, his face draining of color, as Julian confidently strode past him without a single word. Vivian and Kendra visibly recoiled, their artificial smiles completely shattering into expressions of profound, unadulterated shock. They were absolutely paralyzed, entirely unable to comprehend the massive, incredibly brutal snub they had just publicly received in front of the entire high society elite. Julian smoothly parted the massive crowd of wealthy guests. He moved with absolute, undeniable purpose, guiding my precious daughter directly across the bright red carpet. He walked past the murmuring crowd, past my frozen, horrified family, and stopped directly in front of me. Julian released Chloe's small hand. She instantly ran forward, wrapping her small arms tightly around my waist. Julian then slowly, incredibly, and respectfully turned his full, undivided attention directly to me. He raised his right arm and smoothly extended his elbow toward me. My corrupt, highly toxic family watched the entire scene unfold in absolute, completely paralyzed, silent horror. The grand double doors burst open. Julian Davenport enters, flanked by his security team. Beside him is Chloe, dressed in a stunning princess gown. Richard, Terrence, Vivian, and Kendra immediately abandon Aaliyah, rushing forward with fake, sycophantic smiles to greet the billionaire they believe is about to save them. Julian completely ignores their outstretched hands. He walks straight past them, parts. The crowd stops in front of Aaliyah and respectfully extends his arm to her. The heavy, utterly suffocating silence in the grand ballroom remained entirely unbroken as I smoothly placed my hand on Julian's perfectly tailored arm. The sheer weight of his immense global power completely radiated through the vast glittering space, instantly commanding absolute and unwavering submission from every single wealthy guest present. He gently squeezed my arm in a brief, highly reassuring gesture of total solidarity. Then Julian Davenport slowly turned his sharp, incredibly commanding gaze away from my completely frozen, utterly terrified family and looked directly out over the massive sea of elite Atlanta society. Allow me to formally introduce the truly remarkable, incredibly courageous woman who absolutely saved my precious daughter's life. Julian announced, his powerful words echoing loudly off the intricately carved, highly ornate ballroom walls. He gestured gracefully toward me, completely ensuring that every single influential developer, powerful politician, and wealthy socialite in the massive room was absolutely focused directly on my midnight black silk gown and the flawless diamonds resting against my skin. I am incredibly honored and absolutely thrilled to officially announce my brand new, highly esteemed business partner. She is the newly appointed, fully empowered Executive Vice President of Davenport Holdings. Please give your absolute, utmost respect to Aaliyah. The sheer, unadulterated shock that violently ripped through the massive, glittering crowd was absolutely palpable. It was a heavy physical wave of profound, complete disbelief that completely swallowed the grand ballroom. The wealthy elite rapidly exchanged incredibly panicked, highly confused glances. The incredibly powerful local politicians, who had just been loudly laughing at Terrence's fabricated financial jokes, now stared at me with wide, entirely terrified eyes. They instantly recognized that the fundamental, highly established power dynamic of the entire city had just been permanently, violently altered in a single devastating heartbeat. I was no longer the discarded, totally irrelevant outcast of a wealthy family. I was now actively wielding the absolute, completely unmatched power of the Davenport global corporate empire. But the raw, incredibly intense reaction of the elite crowd was absolutely nothing compared to the complete, total, utterly catastrophic meltdown actively occurring directly in front of me. My deeply corrupt, highly toxic family was rapidly, entirely disintegrating under the heavy, crushing weight of Julian's absolute, highly public declaration. The incredibly fragile, carefully fabricated illusion they had spent decades building was violently shattering into millions of tiny, irreparable pieces right before their terrified eyes. Terrence was the very first to completely break. The smooth, highly arrogant Wall Street prodigy persona completely vanished instantly, replaced by a sweaty, utterly desperate, entirely broken man. He took a sudden, highly erratic step backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the bright red carpet. His chest began to rapidly, violently heave as he desperately struggled to pull oxygen into his suffocating lungs. He was actively, highly publicly hyperventilating. His perfectly styled hair was now heavily plastered to his wet forehead, and his hands shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. He aggressively clutched his chest, completely unable to comprehend the massive, terrifying reality that the woman he had actively, viciously mocked was now his ultimate, absolute corporate superior. Right beside him, Richard Davenport was desperately, frantically attempting to salvage his completely ruined, highly leveraged empire. The imposing, incredibly cruel patriarch was rapidly shrinking, entirely losing his commanding, highly authoritative presence. He took a weak, highly unsteady step toward Julian, his hands raised in a desperate, completely pathetic gesture of absolute surrender. "Julian, please, there must be some kind of massive, incredibly unfortunate misunderstanding here." Richard loudly stuttered, his voice completely stripping of its usual highly arrogant bass. The deep, heavy timbre he used to aggressively control boardrooms was entirely gone, replaced by a high, incredibly weak, totally pathetic squeak. "Aaliyah is my daughter, but she has absolutely no corporate experience. We are the ones you want to actively partner with. We are the true, completely legitimate Davenport legacy in this city. I can completely explain everything right now." Julian did not even blink. He completely, utterly ignored Richard's desperate, highly pathetic stuttering, maintaining his cold, absolute, entirely terrifying silence. Kendra was faring absolutely worse. The $15,000 custom emerald green dress she had so proudly flaunted was now completely ruined by the dark red wine stain, perfectly matching the total, absolute ruin of her incredibly fragile ego. Her face had completely drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, highly pale shade of ashen gray. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid, entirely silent succession, making her look exactly like a desperate, highly panicked fish pulled directly out of the water. She swayed violently on her expensive, highly uncomfortable designer heels, her hands aggressively grasping the heavy air around her. She looked exactly like she was going to completely, entirely pass out right there on the bright red ballroom carpet. The absolute, undeniable realization that the sister she had actively, viciously labeled as completely worthless trash was now an incredibly powerful, highly wealthy executive was completely short-circuiting her highly arrogant, deeply toxic brain. Vivian simply stared in complete, utter, entirely silent horror. Her heavy diamond rings hung completely uselessly by her sides. The grand, incredibly lavish coronation she had so meticulously, highly aggressively planned had instantly violently turned into a brutal, completely unforgiving public execution. She was absolutely trapped, entirely unable to escape the blinding, incredibly harsh spotlight of her own massive, deeply unforgivable sins. The heavy, incredibly tense silence stretched on for another long, agonizing moment. The elite, highly influential guests in the massive ballroom remained entirely frozen, completely captivated by the brutal, highly dramatic destruction of the city's most arrogant family. Then Terrence desperately, frantically broke the heavy quiet. His voice was incredibly shrill, completely thick with raw, unadulterated panic. He aggressively pushed past Richard, completely abandoning any remaining shred of professional, highly polished decorum. "But the $50 million, Terrence loudly blurted out, his voice aggressively cracking with pure absolute desperation. He aggressively wiped the heavy sweat from his pale forehead, his eyes darting frantically between Julian and me. "We completely, absolutely finalized the initial term sheets. We are heavily, entirely relying on that massive capital injection. You absolutely promised a massive investment in our corporate hedge fund. We need that money immediately." His incredibly pathetic, totally desperate plea loudly echoed across the sprawling, absolutely silent ballroom. It was the ultimate, completely undeniable confirmation of their profound, absolute financial ruin. They were completely, entirely begging for a massive, unearned bailout in front of the exact high society elite they had spent years aggressively looking down upon. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Terrence. I did not feel any anger. I felt absolute, complete, highly clinical detachment. The heavy executioner's blade was completely raised, and I was entirely ready to smoothly, highly efficiently drop it. I raised my right hand and executed a sharp, incredibly precise, highly calculated signal. Instantly, Julian's elite, highly trained security team sprang into rapid, totally coordinated action. Two massive, heavily armed guards smoothly stepped forward from the shadows near the grand entrance. They carried four massive, incredibly thick, highly heavy black binders. The heavy leather binders were entirely stuffed with thousands of pages of incredibly detailed, utterly undeniable forensic financial evidence. The highly trained guards marched with absolute terrifying precision directly toward the main, highly ornate banquet table positioned perfectly in the center of the glittering ballroom. They reached the massive table and simultaneously, highly aggressively dropped the heavy black binders directly onto the smooth, pristine white tablecloth. The incredibly loud, deeply heavy thud of the massive forensic audit files hitting the solid table sounded exactly like a loud, violent gunshot echoing across the silent room. The expensive crystal champagne flutes violently rattled against the heavy impact. The sharp, highly aggressive noise caused several wealthy guests to visibly physically flinch. I slowly released Julian's perfectly tailored arm and confidently walked directly toward the massive banquet table. My heavy midnight black silk train dragged smoothly across the bright red carpet, creating a soft, highly ominous rustling sound. I stopped perfectly in front of the heavy black binders, my eyes completely locked onto Terrence's sweating, entirely terrified face. The entire massive room collectively held its breath, completely waiting for the final highly devastating strike. I rested my hands lightly against the heavy, cool leather of the massive audit files. I offered Terrence an incredibly cold, utterly ruthless, entirely lethal smile. There is absolutely no $50 million investment. Terrence, I stated smoothly, my voice carrying clearly, completely, and entirely across the massive, utterly silent grand ballroom. The incredibly sharp, highly precise words completely shattered his desperate, highly pathetic illusions. My top cybersecurity engineers have spent the last 48 hours aggressively, completely tearing apart your highly encrypted, deeply fraudulent corporate servers. I smoothly tapped my manicured fingernail against the top of the massive, heavy black binder. The sharp, highly rhythmic clicking sound was incredibly loud in the heavy silence. I did not find any highly brilliant, incredibly aggressive market strategies. I certainly did not find any massive, highly impressive quarterly returns. I slowly leaned forward, completely dropping my voice into a low, incredibly menacing, totally lethal register. But I did find something incredibly interesting, Terrence. I found a massive, completely devastating, heavily disguised $12 million hole located directly in the very center of your primary municipal pension fund. The loud collective gasp that violently ripped through the elite, highly influential crowd was absolutely deafening. The wealthy developers, the powerful politicians, and the jealous socialites completely understood the massive, incredibly terrifying implications of my highly public declaration. Terrence was not simply bankrupt. He was an aggressive, completely ruthless, entirely criminal embezzler who had actively stolen millions of dollars directly from innocent, highly vulnerable public workers. Terrence's knees completely, utterly gave out. He violently collapsed directly onto the bright red carpet, his expensive suit completely rumpling around him. He buried his sweating, deeply pale face entirely into his shaking hands, loudly releasing a pathetic, completely broken sob. He was entirely, absolutely, completely finished. And the incredibly brutal, highly public execution of the Davenport family legacy had only just officially begun. As the devastating reality of my incredibly sharp words fully registered across the utterly silent grand ballroom, a new, entirely terrifying sound suddenly emerged. The loud, highly piercing wail of approaching police sirens violently sliced through the thick, suffocating tension. The bright red and blue emergency lights instantly flashed against the towering, highly ornate glass windows, casting long, deeply ominous shadows directly across the pristine white marble floor. The incredibly wealthy, highly influential guests collectively gasped again, rapidly stepping completely back from the center of the massive room. The heavy, intricately carved wooden doors were aggressively pushed open once again. A large, highly coordinated team of federal agents aggressively stormed directly into the glittering, totally paralyzed space. The stern, completely unyielding men wore dark navy windbreakers with massive yellow letters proudly displaying their absolute government authority. The lead investigator smoothly marched straight toward the incredibly pathetic, violently sobbing figure of Terrence, actively groveling on the bright red carpet. Terrence frantically raised his head, his deeply pale, entirely wet face completely contorting in raw, unadulterated horror as the heavily armed agents quickly surrounded him. The sharp, highly distinctive metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs instantly echoed across the completely quiet room. Terrence immediately began to loudly, violently scream, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his deeply fabricated corporate dignity. He aggressively thrashed against the incredibly strong, completely unyielding grip of the federal agents, his expensive suit tearing violently at the seams. "Please, you must absolutely listen to me right now," Terrence begged, his shrill, utterly pathetic voice violently echoing across the grand ballroom. "I can absolutely entirely explain the missing pension funds. It was simply a minor accounting error. I did not deliberately steal that money. You cannot publicly arrest me right here in front of all these highly important people." The federal agents completely ignored his desperate, highly frantic pleading, violently jerking him upward with absolute, entirely unforgiving force. They began to aggressively drag his heavily flailing, completely broken body directly across the pristine white marble floor. The elite, incredibly influential developers and powerful local politicians watched the entire, highly humiliating spectacle with cold, completely detached disgust. They entirely refused to meet his desperate, highly manic eyes as he was violently hauled straight through the massive crowd. His loud, incredibly pathetic sobbing completely faded as the heavy mahogany doors aggressively slammed shut directly behind his utterly disgraced, permanently ruined figure. The sheer absolute finality of his violent public arrest entirely shattered the remaining fragile sanity of my deeply corrupt family. Kendra completely, utterly lost her highly arrogant, totally toxic mind. The dark red wine stain heavily ruining her $15,000 emerald green designer dress suddenly seemed completely insignificant compared to the absolute, undeniable destruction of her fake, highly privileged world. She released a loud, incredibly ear-piercing, violently unhinged shriek that completely rattled the heavy crystal chandeliers hanging far above us. Her previously pale face instantly turned an incredibly dark, highly unhealthy shade of pure, blinding, completely raw rage. "You completely ruined my entire perfect life," Kendra roared loudly, her voice entirely stripped of its usual highly polished high society elegance. She violently lunged directly forward, her hands aggressively curling into sharp, completely deadly claws, aimed straight at my calm, entirely unaffected face. She desperately intended to violently rip the flawless diamonds directly from my neck. She moved with the incredibly erratic, totally unpredictable speed of a cornered, deeply terrified animal. But she was absolutely completely blind to the massive, highly trained security perimeter standing directly between her unhinged, violent aggression and my perfectly composed, incredibly powerful physical presence. Before Kendra could even take a second frantic step, the elite, heavily armed bodyguards violently sprang into absolute, completely terrifying action. Two massive, incredibly muscular men smoothly intercepted her highly erratic, entirely desperate trajectory with cold, highly clinical precision. They forcefully grabbed her flailing arms, violently twisting her aggressively resisting body around with absolute, completely effortless power. In one smooth, incredibly brutal motion, they instantly violently pinned Kendra directly face down onto the soft, bright red carpet. Her highly expensive designer dress ripped loudly as her cheek aggressively smashed straight into the thick, heavily woven fabric of the carpet floor. Kendra continued to loudly, violently shriek into the heavy carpet, aggressively thrashing her legs in a completely pathetic, entirely useless display of raw fury. The massive, completely unyielding security guards remained perfectly still, easily holding her entirely broken, deeply humiliated form firmly against the ground with absolute terrifying ease. The incredibly wealthy, incredibly highly elite guests watched her violent, totally unhinged public meltdown with absolute, undeniable shock. The deeply arrogant, incredibly cruel sister, who had viciously mocked my entirely innocent daughter, was now fully, highly publicly reduced to a screaming, completely powerless, utterly pathetic mess, groveling directly at my designer feet. The sudden, highly violent physical subjugation of their favorite golden child finally completely broke the last remaining psychological defenses of my incredibly toxic parents. Richard and Vivian Davenport simultaneously collapsed directly to their shaking, highly unstable knees. The heavy, completely undeniable weight of their total, absolute corporate and social destruction violently forced them straight down onto the bright red carpet. Their previously haughty, incredibly cruel faces were now completely entirely covered in heavy, pathetic tears. The imposing, highly authoritative patriarch and the elegant, deeply arrogant matriarch were completely, utterly gone, instantly replaced by two broken, deeply terrified, incredibly small individuals. Aaliyah, please, you must absolutely listen to us right now. Vivian loudly wept, her voice aggressively cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. Her incredibly heavy diamond rings loudly scraped against the marble floor as she frantically crawled directly forward, desperately reaching her shaking hands toward the hem of my midnight black silk gown. We are completely, entirely so deeply sorry for every single awful thing we actively did to you. You are our beautiful, incredibly precious daughter. We are your own flesh and blood. You absolutely cannot do this terrible, deeply destructive thing to your own truly loving, devoted family now. Richard aggressively joined her desperate, highly pathetic, groveling his tears, mixing heavily with the thick, cold sweat actively pouring down his pale face. Please, Aaliyah, you must immediately order your men to release your sister, Richard loudly pleaded, his voice completely stripping of its deep, highly commanding timbre. We were totally, incredibly wrong to treat you and your sweet daughter so poorly. I will absolutely restore your full, entirely rightful place within the Davenport family legacy this exact second. You and Chloe belong completely with us. You cannot highly publicly destroy the only real, true family you actually possess today. I stood perfectly, incredibly still, my posture completely straight, my expression entirely calm and entirely devoid of any sudden emotional weakness. I looked directly down at the two desperate, highly pathetic people aggressively weeping directly at my feet. The elite, incredibly influential guests in the massive ballroom remained absolutely silent, eagerly hanging on to every single, highly dramatic second of this profound, completely total reckoning. I did not feel a single solitary shred of pity for the incredibly corrupt, deeply cruel individuals who had viciously discarded my innocent child. The heavy, highly sharp, incredibly lethal blade was completely ready to fall. I did not step back from their frantically reaching hands. I simply looked directly into his wide, entirely terrified, deeply desperate eyes. Your fake, highly fabricated words are completely, utterly meaningless to me now, Richard, I stated coldly, my voice cutting sharply and perfectly across the incredibly silent grand ballroom. You entirely lost the absolute right to call yourselves my family. The exact moment you viciously forced me and my incredibly innocent daughter out into the freezing, totally unforgiving rain. You actively, highly aggressively chose your fake, completely hollow corporate empire over your own true flesh and blood right then. You honestly believed your immense, highly leveraged wealth completely protected you from any absolute, undeniable consequences. I continued smoothly, my voice dropping into a low, incredibly menacing, totally lethal register. But you were completely, absolutely wrong. I personally authorized the immediate, totally absolute purchase of your deeply fraudulent, highly toxic corporate debt directly from the Central Banking Consortium early this morning. You no longer own a single solitary piece of your vast, incredibly fragile financial empire. You do not possess a single dime of actual, completely legitimate liquidity. Your entire highly corrupt house of cards has completely, entirely collapsed today. Tomorrow, starting at exactly 8 in the morning, your massive, highly prized suburban mansion will be completely, absolutely foreclosed upon by the Central Banking Authority, I loudly declared, delivering the final, highly devastating, completely fatal blow to their completely broken minds. You have absolutely no hidden trust fund remaining. You have no powerful, highly profitable company left to save you. You have absolutely no historic, deeply prestigious house to frantically retreat into. You are officially, completely, and permanently left with absolutely nothing. You are entirely, definitively finished in this city, and you will never, ever rise to corrupt power again. The devastating reality of my absolute declaration hung heavily in the chilling air of the grand ballroom. I stared down at the trembling, broken forms of Richard and Vivian Davenport groveling on the bright red carpet. Their desperate, pathetic weeping echoed loudly against the incredibly high ceilings, but the sound completely failed to touch my heart. The massive crowd of influential politicians and wealthy developers remained entirely silent, actively watching the brutal, undeniable destruction of the city's most arrogant dynasty. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. I smoothly turned away from their shattered, completely ruined lives. I gently scooped my beautiful daughter into my arms. Her innocent eyes were wide with quiet curiosity. Her small hands instantly wrapped around my neck, providing the only warmth I truly needed. Julian stood perfectly solid beside me. He smoothly extended his tailored arm, offering a silent, undeniable pillar of absolute strength. I placed my free hand lightly against his dark sleeve, feeling the immense, unwavering support radiating from him. Together, we walked deliberately across the sprawling, pristine marble floor. The elite crowd rapidly parted, creating a wide, entirely clear path for our exit. They actively bowed their heads in silent, absolute reverence. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open, welcoming us into the bright, incredibly promising light of the massive outer lobby. I did not look back a single time. I left the toxic, completely broken remnants of my fake family sobbing pathetically in the suffocating darkness of their own profound failure. 6 short months later, the absolute reality of their total destruction had completely solidified into inescapable torment. The harsh, unforgiving justice I had swiftly enacted had permanently altered their pathetic destinies. Terrence was completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his aggressive, arrogant Wall Street persona. He was now heavily confined within the cold and unforgiving concrete walls of a maximum security federal prison. He was actively serving a brutal, completely mandatory 15-year sentence for massive corporate fraud and egregious embezzlement. His days were spent scrubbing highly unsanitary cafeteria floors, a devastating fall for a man who once aggressively believed he was an untouchable financial god. Meanwhile, Kendra was enduring her own deeply humiliating, entirely public purgatory. The $15,000 designer gowns were completely gone, violently replaced by a cheap, incredibly stiff polyester uniform. She was actively working as a lowly, entirely disposable hostess at the exact same incredibly exclusive downtown restaurant she used to carelessly rent out for her lavish, incredibly arrogant birthday parties. Every single night, she was brutally forced to paste a fake, highly strained smile onto her pale face and politely seat the very same wealthy socialites who had once eagerly attended her elite gatherings. Those former friends now ignored her desperate gaze, treating her with the exact same cold disdain she had once so viciously directed at me. Her fragile ego was completely shattered with every single condescending tip pushed aggressively across the reservation podium. The mighty, incredibly proud Davenport patriarch and his highly demanding, deeply arrogant wife suffered the most absolute catastrophic fall from their fabricated grace. Richard and Vivian were evicted from their massive, sprawling suburban mansion the exact morning after the grand gala. Their incredibly vast, highly leveraged wealth evaporated into thin air, leaving them with absolutely zero assets. They currently reside in a cramped, heavily decaying, deeply run-down apartment located on the absolute outer, undesirable edge of the city. The peeling wallpaper and heavily stained linoleum floors are a constant, deeply brutal reminder of their massive, unrecoverable failure. Their highly prized society friends had instantly, completely vanished the exact second the devastating news of their massive bankruptcy hit the local papers. Their incredibly lucrative retirement funds were totally liquidated to partially cover the massive, incredibly heavy fines imposed by federal regulators. Richard spends his empty, totally meaningless days staring blankly out of a dirty, incredibly cracked window, completely mourning his lost empire. Vivian paces the incredibly narrow, deeply claustrophobic hallway, her heavy diamond rings completely replaced by bare, shaking fingers. They are entirely, completely isolated, living trapped within a massive, deeply inescapable prison, built entirely from their own profound arrogance and deeply unforgivable cruelty. They are officially left with absolutely nothing but the heavy, highly toxic weight of their own massive, highly destructive regrets. I stood tall, entirely poised, and incredibly confident in the exact center of the massive, truly breathtaking penthouse office of Davenport Holdings. The incredibly thick, highly polished floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a truly stunning, perfectly unobstructed view of the glittering, expansive Atlanta skyline. The city was completely, absolutely mine to command. The morning sun poured brightly into the incredibly large, beautifully designed executive suite, casting a warm, golden glow directly across the incredibly expensive, deeply plush rug. Chloe was sitting happily right in the center of the soft sunlight, quietly playing with a colorful set of expensive, highly detailed educational toys. Her innocent, completely carefree laughter echoed brightly against the modern, highly sophisticated walls, instantly filling the massive space with pure, unadulterated joy. Julian smoothly walked directly across the room, moving with his usual highly impressive, completely silent grace. He stopped right beside me and gently handed me a steaming, perfectly brewed cup of dark, rich coffee. He offered a warm, incredibly genuine, deeply affectionate smile that completely melted the cold, highly clinical executive exterior he usually presented to the demanding corporate world. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of the hot coffee, feeling the absolute, completely undeniable warmth spread deeply through my chest. I looked directly down at my beautiful, entirely safe daughter, and then I looked back out over the sprawling, incredibly busy city far below. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, absolute choice, and the people who stand firmly by you in the darkest, most terrifying storm is what truly makes a family. Never be afraid to violently cut out the toxic rot, to actively, completely, and permanently save your own beautiful, incredibly precious life.